Hey guys, so let's talk boxing. Yeah, obviously, before we get into boxing, it's a shock yesterday. I was really shocked at Marvin Hagler passing away. I saw a post on Instagram on one of the boxing channels just by accident. I was just going to check my Instagram, and I couldn't believe it. I saw, when you see a picture and it said "Rest in Peace," and I didn't believe it. First thought was, can't Marvin Hagler can't have died. He's too young, and it didn't feel that long ago I was watching him doing interviews, talking about his career and talking about the fighters of this era. So I just couldn't believe it. So I had to check it a few times, and then obviously text my brother and text a few people, and you start seeing it coming out, and then you realise it's true. So yeah, it's really really sad. It's always sad when someone passes away, but it's a shock when a legend like Hagler passes away. And I did a live stream yesterday. So what I will add today is, I think it's a good way of paying respect when someone passes away. Is obviously I've got nothing but positive things to say, but my memories, obviously with Marvin Hagler, that wasn't my era, right? I was born in 1983. So any of you that were born in 83, obviously Hagler reigned from the late 70s to sort of the late 80s. I think it was 87. I think he reigned from, was it 79 to 87? I might not be totally accurate. Let's just do a quick check here. Right, I should have really checked before, but I'm just getting on the camera and doing this video straight away. Let's have a look. Hold on a sec. Okay, so yeah, Marvin Hagler competed in boxing from 1973 to 87. Yeah, so obviously, in 87, how old was I? 83, 84, I was only like 4, 83, 45. So yeah, I was 4. So I don't remember that era. That generation was my dad's generation. So any of you that were born in the same as me in the 80s, I don't remember at that age. I didn't know about Hagler, Hearns, Roberto Duran, Marvin Hagler. The generation, the era that I grew up in was Nigel Benn, Chris Eubanks, Mike Tyson, Steve Collins, Frank Bruno, Lennox Lewis, Oscar De La Hoya, Prince Nazim Hamid, Oscar De La Hoya, Barrera. They're the fighters that are kind of cemented in my memory. Obviously there were other fighters, but they were like the ones. And Nigel Benn was that was my favourite growing up. I liked Nigel Benn, and I remember his fights with Chris Eubank, and then obviously I remember Chris Eubank's fights with the Celtic Warrior Steve Collins. So yeah, so I kind of missed that era. And obviously I know that obviously Hearns, I think all of them did. Hearns, apart from Hagler, they boxed on. They boxed on in the 90s, late 90s, but I don't remember them that well. So how I got introduced to Hagler was basically, my dad bought me this DVD called The Fantastic Four. How old was I? This must be more than 15 years ago. I was in my early 20s. I was just starting boxing. I wanted to go down and learn boxing and do some sparring and see if I could do some amateur boxing. So my dad bought me this DVD and said, watch these guys. He said, watch Hearns, because at the time I was tall, skinny. My build was similar to Hearns. I'm around the same height. I'm maybe a bit short, 6'1.5". So he said, watch these guys. These guys were unbelievable. And he started telling me about Hagler and when I watched this DVD, right, I remember just being so I was so in awe. I was so shocked at how good these guys were. I remember, because it's only natural. You always kind of think your era's the best. Obviously growing up watching, as I said, Collins and Eubanks and Ben and Lennox Lewis and Frank Bruno and De La Hoya and Bernard Hopkins. But when I saw these guys, when I saw Sugar Ray Leonard fighting with Thomas Hearns, and I saw Hagler, Duran, Hagler Hearns, and Hagler Leonard, my first initial thoughts were, well, oh my God, these guys are better than the guys today. Those guys back then, they would beat the guys, even though these guys are really good. And I obviously look up to these guys, and these are the guys I watched on television. I remember thinking, I don't think, no disrespect and honesty, Nigel Benn and Chris Eubanks, they couldn't beat these guys. These guys are too skillful, they're too good, and these guys are 15-round fighters. The fighters of my generation were 12-round fighters, and they just looked more skilled. They were more skilled. You can't really deny it. And when I saw just how fit these guys were, and how, just how built Marvin Hagler was, that bald head, that muscly physique, that there's just his relentlessness, and obviously the most famous three rounds in boxing history, middleweight history, the Hagler Hearns, just unbelievable. And I just got fascinated. I must have watched those fights. I must have watched them, like, I don't even know the number, so many times, to the point where I remember, like if you've watched a film many times, I would know when what punches were going to happen. I watched them so many times, and I got really inspired to train hard, and it got me interested in more of the older generation, the older eras in boxing, and it just really captured my imagination. And I remember just thinking, the way these guys move, the way they fight, they're just warriors. And it was really hard to say like who was the best, because they were all as good as each other. And obviously Marvin Hagler was he just had that reputation. He had that aura about him, that kind of, he was quite, he was just terrifying. He had just had that unbeatable aura. And these guys were the real deal, man. They were the real deal, and I could feel that. It's not like I needed someone to tell me that or explain that to me, or break down the significance of how good these guys were at that time, and the great fights that they had, in America, in all the famous places, like wherever they fought, Las Vegas, and I just knew it. I just from soon as I put the DVD on and I started watching it, I knew that these guys are really special. Something's different. And I remember showing a friend, and yeah, that's what really amazed me, because you often hear people say, well, obviously naturally things get better as time goes on, and that's true, but in some cases it's not true, because it can't always be true, because like I said, the era of Hagler, Hearns, Duran and Leonard, that even today, the guys today, they're not beating those guys. I'm just being honest. And anyone with any common sense in boxing, the experts will say that. There's very few people that would have competed with them. And, I'm going back another era. I'm going back to, like I said, Collins, all great fighters that I watched growing up. Nigel Benn, I was a huge Nigel Benn fan. And Chris Eubanks and Michael Watson, all those guys, that they wouldn't have beaten Sugar Ray Leonard. They wouldn't have beat Marvin Hagler and Duran. They just weren't good enough. They weren't at that. These guys are special. They were special. These guys were on another level, and I knew that the moment I put that DVD on and I started watching it. It was just something different. The way they fought, and they just were relentless. These guys were fearless, and just the skill. Like I said, my attention to details, I think it's really, really good. Probably like most people, everyone probably thinks that, right? But I remember just watching, the way Hagler moved, the footwork, the toughness, and the boxing ability, and it was just such a high level of boxing, because most of the time in boxing, you get a fighter who's fighting another fighter who's not on his level, and they're just outmatched. But with these guys, they were all greats. They were all Hall of Famers. They were all elite fighters competing with one another. It's basically like a tournament, and they all fought each other numerous times, and that's what I love, the rematches, the rubber matches. And I was blown away. And obviously that time, I'm not sure if, well, you couldn't get the fights on YouTube like you can now. That's what made me appreciate DVDs back then. You couldn't go online and write in, Hagler and watch the full fights. I don't even think there were clips on YouTube at that time when my dad bought me that DVD for my birthday. I was about 20 or 21 maybe a bit younger, or 20, something like that, very early 20s, right? And obviously now I'm in my late 30s, so it was, I watched that. I used to watch that every night before I went to bed. I'd watch some Bruce Lee, 'cause I'm a big fan of Bruce Lee, and I'd watch the Fantastic Four, and I would study it. I was trying to pick who I thought was the best, and it was hard. You go back and forward, and obviously that famous fight, my dad gave me the history. He broke it down for me when Sugar Ray Leonard come out of retirement. I think it was after 5 years, right? Again, apologies if my facts are not completely accurate, but it's close enough. When he came out of retirement to go up to middleweight and fight Marvin Hagler, it was just a huge fight. Everyone thought Leonard they thought it was suicide. It was crazy. They thought Hagler was gonna kill him, was gonna destroy him, really hurt him. But obviously, it's a controversial fight. Some people think Hagler won it. Some people think Leonard won it, and I suppose it depends on how you scored the fight, what you like, coming forward with aggression, intelligent aggression in Hagler's case, relentlessness, or Sugar Ray Leonard's approach, which was boxing, hitting, frustrating, and kind of dancing out. Some people would say he kind of ran the whole fight, right? Which I don't think that's the right word to use, but he didn't want to. He couldn't stay there and really. I mean, he went toe to toe with Hagler maybe in spurts, but that was it's unbelievable fight. All their fights were unbelievable. All of them. Roberto Duran, Hearns, these guys were just. There's not really much more you can say. So it was just a different level of boxing that I hadn't seen really. I don't think I'd ever seen that level at that particular time, and I just remember thinking, wow, I wish I was around to have seen it, to have been there in that era of my dad's generation, to have watched those fights live, and to have, to have followed the story, to have experienced the build-up. But obviously can't change that. But yeah, it was there was an energy about that era and about those guys. There's a nostalgia, and even now, everywhere you go, that their names will always come up. People have got such a respect. It's just like Marvin Hagler is obviously, he's cemented his legacy, his reputation, and and a lot of the rumours about how hard he trained, and the fact that he used to kind of just that hat he wears, and with wearing that hat of war, and with the hood on, and the Nike t-shirts, and it's just that natural fascination with fighters and their toughness, and you can't fake that. You saw these guys, how tough they were in the ring. So a lot of the fighters, obviously the generations after Marvin Hagler, you see a lot of the fighters that have been inspired and that have modelled their styles, tried to. You can never be a Marvin Hagler. You can't. There's only one. You can't be a Sugar Ray Leonard. But the fighters have been inspired by them. The generations that have come after have obviously been inspired and stuff. And even come to think of it, I just thought this now. It's a small thing. Derek Chisora calls himself War Chisora. He wears the hat, so he's been inspired by Hagler. So many people have been inspired. I mean, that's the great thing about that era. Individually, they were all greats. They're all famous. They're for good reason. But collectively, it was like a thought. It was so you can never really. Whenever you say Hagler, you always think Leonard, and when you say Leonard, you think Hagler. When you say Hearns, vice versa. When you say Duran, because of them being in the same era. I mean, it's just amazing, isn't it? We don't really get that today. We get an era where you'll get maybe two fighters, like you'll get Anthony Joshua and Fury, or you get Tyson. I know you had Tyson and Holyfield and Lewis, but in the middleweight division and the welterweight division, you don't usually get 4 guys that are absolute elite and they can all beat each other. It's more or less 2, like you get Crawford and Errol Spence. So it was a unique time. It was just such a unique time in the 70s to the 80s and kind of the late 80s where that generation where those guys were competing. And like I said, even though I was born in a different time and I was a bit too young to remember, and I didn't see those fights then. I was, obviously my dad did, but I was like 4 years of age, 5, 6. My earliest memories were more probably when I was around 10, 11 I started watching. My memories are of, Nigel Benn fighting, Chris Eubanks fighting, and I remember the Collins Eubanks fights, and I remember the Barrera Morales fights and all that. So yeah, it was. I was really inspired by Marvin Hagler. That's why I was really sad when I heard the news. I was shocked because they always struck me as they're really nice people, good men, honourable men, and respectful and humble. And I've seen all their interviews. I've watched loads. So it was only like a couple of weeks ago that I watched the Hagler Leonard fight again. I wanted to watch it back and see who I fought won and score it, and I watched it and enjoyed it. I'm going to watch their fights again, and I knew at some point I would talk about the Fantastic Four, that era on this channel. And I've always thought, I always in my head go, how would Mayweather and Pacquiao done against these guys? Could they have? I think they could have competed with them, but whether they could have beaten them, that's I'm really not sure, But most of the generations, I don't think. Like when people say, who do you think would have won out of Triple G and Hagler? I think Marvin Hagler would have beaten him. I think he was just too strong, too relentless, and actually a better fighter, a better boxer. Even though Triple G is a great fighter, but I just think it's hard to say. But even Canelo, I couldn't see Canelo at middleweight beating Hagler at middleweight. It would be a good fight, but I just there's just something. They just got that bit extra, and I can't see. There's no way, There's just no way that Steve Collins, Nigel Benn, and Chris Eubanks Jr. No, sorry, not Chris Eubanks Jr. Chris Eubanks Sr. They couldn't have beaten Marvin Hagler at middleweight. I just got to be honest, and just even though I looked up to these guys and I still like them a lot, but they just. Hagler was too tough. He was too strong and too fit and too much strength. And he had a granite chin. And even other middleweights, it would have. There's some out there. I mean, Roy Jones Jr. in his prime at middleweight against Hagler. I personally think Hagler wins. It would be a close fight. It could have gone the either way. James Toney, unbelievable fighter at middleweight against Hagler. I'd always have to kind of lean slightly towards Hagler. Would have been a great fight though. But most of the middleweights, the guys today, they just wouldn't. I think they wouldn't have made it out the ring onto. They wouldn't have gone to a decision with Hagler. He's too tough, too strong, and I remember my dad telling me when he came over to England, he fought Alan Minter, and obviously Alan Minter was a really good champion in Britain, and Marvin Hagler, we know what happened in that fight. Obviously, I don't want to speak ill of people that have passed away, so respect to the guys, but Hagler won that fight in traumatic fashion. So it's as the years have gone by, I've got to know, you get to know him more, and you really respect him, and you can understand and feel, even though I wasn't born in that generation, you can just feel it, it's hard to explain, but you can sense the respect that people had for those fighters and how respected they were amongst fans in the boxing world, and they'll be remembered for forever in boxing history. So rest in peace to Marvin Hagler, and obviously condolences to his family, but yeah, he's inspired me, and the fact that I'm doing this video talking about how it inspired me when I was in my 20s, it did inspire me to be stronger in life, and it also inspired me to learn more about the history of boxing, and because at the time I was really just watching, my era, and it made me go back and then look at other fighters and go even further back than the 70s and the 80s, the golden era of boxing, and start watching the great Mexican fights, and then even go back to the generation of Muhammad Ali, Frazier, and then also to watch Sugar Ray Robinson and Jake LaMotta, Rocky Marciano, Jack Dempsey, enjoying that era, Joe Louis, Gene Tunney, all going even further back to the greats, going really studying the history. But I'm still studying it, so yeah. I always struggle when as good as I'm a big Pacquiao fan. He's probably my favourite fighter of all time, but obviously I don't think. Well, maybe Pacquiao could have fought Hagler because Hagler was a bit too big for him, but Pacquiao pretty much fought middleweights. But I don't know, man. I'm not confident in saying Mayweather or Pacquiao or Golovkin or Canelo could have beaten Hagler. It's not something I just can confidently say. Yeah, they would have beaten him. That's how good he was. He's that. Fighters like that. It's like they kind of travel into every era, even though these fights we'll never see. It's not possible, obviously, but hypothetically, you do the best you can to make a decision based on looking at the different areas of how good the fighters were, who they beat at the time, and like I said, you got to give these guys even more credit because they had to fight harder opposition. Most of the guys today, they don't have the opposition that Marvin Hagler had at that time. They're not around greats, you know what I mean? Yeah, they're not around. It's easier, and it's not their fault. It's not the boxers' fault. Obviously, the boxers can only beat who's in front of them and who's around at their time. They can only be the best, but you still have to give credit and say, look, all of the middleweights, the generations of most of the middleweights after, they didn't have it in most cases. Now, I know obviously Hopkins, amazing era. I'll do a video at some point. He fought tough opposition, and obviously Roy Jones did, and James Toney. But away from that, a lot of the other middleweights, they didn't have the level of competition that Marvin Hagler. They didn't have to fight Roberto Duran. They didn't have to fight Tommy Hearns. They didn't have to fight Sugar Ray Leonard. Can you imagine? You're the best, but then you're up against that. That makes the wins way more precious, way more significant than you being the best middleweight in your division and then fighting opposition that are not at your level. Where those guys, as I said, they could all beat each other on any given night. They could all, and you saw it happen. They all beat each other. Duran beat Leonard with the first fight, no mass. Leonard came back, beat Duran. I think he beat Duran again, beat him twice. Then Duran fought Hearns. Hearns beat Duran. And then Hearns had close fights. Then Leonard beat Hearns, and then Leonard obviously beat Hagler, got decision, and then Hagler. That's amazing. It's unbelievable. In a sense, it puts to shame what happens today. The fighters don't even fight each other. Errol Spence and Crawford. It's frustrating. They're not even fighting each other. In some ways, you got to give credit. Canelo and Triple G fought, but Canelo's not. I don't know. Today they don't. And when they do fight each other, it takes ages. By the time they fight, they're past it, or one's in their prime, one isn't. So we don't really have that. We've never. And I suppose you got to give credit because at least with Nigel Benn and Eubanks and all those guys, they did all fight each other, right? But even that era, that was a great era, but it wasn't as great as the Fantastic Four. Eubanks, Watson, Gerald McLennan, amazing era, great era. You have to obviously respect it. And they did all fight each other. Collins fought Eubanks. Ben fought Chris Eubanks. Ben fought Michael Watson. Michael Watson fought. So yeah, those guys, give them credit, but the level was below the Marvin Hagler, Tommy Hearns and Duran, and it was those guys. Even though we say, oh, boxers of today would be better than boxers back then because nutrition's come such a long way. We've got science now, more science. We've got supplements. We've got strength. That's just a load of bollocks, man. Because even with all the supplements and the strength trainers, why can't the guys today, most of them, they can't do 15 rounds? Hagler's era, Marvin Hagler, those guys did 15-round fights, Thomas Hearns. So that doesn't make sense, your argument, when people say that. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting, and it wouldn't be factual, that all of the guys in this generation can't beat any of the guys back then, because obviously they can. But I'm just saying there's certain eras, like the Marvin Hagler era, that are almost unbeatable. That the generations today, or it would be incredibly difficult for them. So I guess. That's what it meant to me. This is my feelings. I'm a bit tired, I've got to have my dinner, but my feelings, that's how I feel. That's how I understood it. That's my experience. And obviously I'm non-biased because I would want to say my era is the best when I was born. The guys that I watched were the best, but I couldn't lie. I couldn't say that because I knew in my heart that wasn't true. So that's how much Hagler and those fights meant to me, and how much they inspired me and made me want to be stronger and train and be fitter, and it did. At the time I got super fit watching these guys, because it made me go down the gym and just stick at it and just train like I trained like a maniac when I was younger. I was a fitness fanatic. I was obsessed. I was super skinny back then, but fit and always training, always doing weights, always training boxing. At a certain time, always sparring, did loads of sparring, hard sparring. Always running, sprinting, skipping, and it's because of watching people like Marvin Hagler, and obviously other boxers and Berba that inspired me. And obviously later on, my generation, Ricky Hatton, Joe Calzaghe. It's how it inspires you. So yeah, so I hope all of you enjoyed this video, and we'll talk boxing more. But yeah, that's my take on Hagler. Rest in peace to Marvin Hagler, probably the greatest middleweight champion of all time. And yeah, thanks for the inspiration.